and welcome to the Tainted Tavern. I'm going to read something for you in a moment. You can probably guess what I'm reading from after the first 4 words. So let's go. As you are aware, Watson, there is no one who knows the higher criminal world of London so well as I do. For years past, I have continually been conscious of some power behind the malefactor, some deep organising power which forever stands in the way of the law and throws its shield over the wrongdoer. Again and again, in cases of the most varying sorts, forgery cases, robberies, murders, I have felt the presence of his force. And I have deduced its actions in many of those undiscovered crimes in which I have not been personally consulted. For years I have endeavoured to break through the veil which shrouded it, and at last the time came when I seized my thread and followed it until it led me, after 1,000 cunning windings, to ex-Professor Moriarty of mathematical celebrity. He is the Napoleon of crime, Watson. He is the organiser of half that is evil and nearly all that is undetected in this great city. He is a genius, a philosopher, an abstract thinker. He is a brain of the first order. He sits motionless like a spider in the centre of his web. But that web has 1,000 radiations, and he knows well every quiver of each of them. He does little himself. He only plans. That segment there comes from the 1893 story, The Final Problem, which famously was the story in which Arthur Conan Doyle used to kill off his character Sherlock Holmes. Of course, Sherlock Holmes didn't stay dead for too long, and Doyle did eventually resurrect him first of all in the novel Beyond the Baskervilles, which was actually a prequel set before the events at the Reichenbach Falls in Switzerland, where Holmes fell to his death. But then he properly resurrected him years later in The Adventure of the Empty House. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about this story today is I've discovered a new favourite podcast called Light in the Pipes. I stumbled on this podcast by accident because I thought it was a podcast about pipe smoking, and as regular patrons of the Tainted Tavern know, I do enjoy a pipe from time to time. But this is not a pipe smoking podcast. It's a podcast about books, films, and it's really a great podcast. I've listened to several other episodes since discovering this podcast by pure chance over the last few weeks. They did a great one on Ellis Peters' A Morbid Taste for Bones, the first of the Brother Cadfael adventures. They've also done a great one on the Maigret and the Headless Corpse, the Simeon novel. But yesterday I listened to their podcast on The Final Problem. And as much as I enjoy the podcast, and I do recommend anyone who enjoys a podcast and who is interested in literature and films, that they check out this podcast, and I'll leave a link down below, because both of the hosts of the podcast are very knowledgeable, and they put a lot of study into the subjects that they're covering. But they took exception with the old story, The Final Problem, and they do have a point in a way, but I think that they missed out on a greater point. And one of the complaints against the story was that Moriarty is suddenly presented to the reader as this malevolent force, Sherlock Holmes' nemesis. He's Joker to Holmes' Batman, Lex Luthor to Holmes' Superman, and yet we've never heard of him in the canon previously. And that was their one complaint, and it is valid, because if you look at some of the TV adaptations and film adaptations of Sherlock Holmes, Benedict Cumberbatch's Sherlock, which I thought was excellent right up to the last season, showed Moriarty before it built up to their story, which was based on The Final Problem. They made him a present where Doyle didn't. But what I felt that the hosts of Light in the Pipe podcast failed to take into account was the time when these stories were written and the purpose that these stories were written. These stories were short stories. They were written for publication in a Strand magazine, so they were largely considered, disposable literature. They were bought, they were enjoyed, and the magazines were cast aside. And you try and get a copy of the vintage copy of the Strand magazine with any of the Sherlock Holmes stories in them, any of the 56 short stories that the Strand published, and you will pay a fortune if indeed you can find them. So when Doyle decided to kill off Sherlock Holmes by famously tossing him over the Reichenbach Falls in Switzerland, he had to find a suitable nemesis, and I think Doyle did a great thing in the final problem in introducing Moriarty, a character who we'd never heard of before, and it's doubtful that Doyle really knew or had heard of Moriarty prior to starting work on the final problem. The character of Moriarty was very much an invention for the story The Final Problem, and it is a really great story. I reread it earlier today, and considering now that it's more than 100 years old, it's really pacey. It moves with the pace of a modern thriller. Doyle really, as much as he grew to dislike Holmes, and indeed he only brought Holmes back in the, as I said, in the novel The Under the Basketballs, and the short story The Adventure of the Empty House, which led on to a series of more Holmes stories, but these stories were never as good as the ones that have been published in the first and second series in the Strand magazine. Doyle had grown tired of Holmes. He felt that Holmes was keeping him away from his more important work, or at least what he considered to be his more important work. And it's nice. It's kind of fascinating to think what Doyle would think of his creation, were he able to come into the modern world and look at the effect that Holmes has had. The fact that after all these years, Holmes is still being talked about. Just enjoying a dram of the grouse, the famous grouse here. I'm a puff on my vape. I'd like to be smoking my pipe now while I'm doing this video, but I can't. My wife's home and she'll kill me if I smoke anything else. So my little discussion, I suppose we could call, is a 3 vape problem. So Moriarty was very much created because there was a need to create a supervillain. And that's what Doyle was doing with Moriarty. He was creating perhaps the world's first supervillain in order to kill off Sherlock Holmes. But Doyle had had enough of him. And when the story was first published in the Strand magazine, there was a massive outcry from the readers because Holmes had died. The Strand magazine lost thousands of subscriptions virtually overnight, and it was lucky to survive the initial few months after Holmes had been killed off, because it was dropping subscriptions. It was like if the Strand was a ship, it had taken on several leaks. It was slowly sinking, but it did manage to survive, of course. But it would never reach its previous heights, even when Holmes was brought back many years later. But that was the only issue that I took with the Light in the Pipes podcast review of The Final Problem. I thought the review was fair, but the complaint about Moriarty suddenly coming into the loop, I think, misses the point of the way these stories were written, and the world at the time for which these stories were written. It was Doyle didn't think that anyone would still be remembering Sherlock Holmes 10 years from now, let alone well over 100 years. And the story itself is really pacey. It starts off with Watson at home. Holmes comes to visit him. Holmes is slightly injured, and he seems to be worried that someone is outside with an air gun. Holmes then tells Watson of Moriarty. The section I read at the opening of this video comes from that initial few pages of The Final Problem. But Holmes has put the thing in motion that will allow the police to finally bring Moriarty to justice, but it's going to take a few days before they'll be able to act on this. So Holmes decides that he has to be out of the way at least until Monday, when the police will be able to act, and he asks Watson to accompany him on a trip to the continent so they can keep away, keep his head down, and by then Holmes believes the very real danger presented by Professor Moriarty, the Napoleon of crime, will be nullified. So Watson agrees, and the pair of them go away the following day. Watson travels to the train station alone. Holmes has already gone on. Watson gets on the train. He doesn't see Holmes there, but he's put in a room with a priest of sorts, and the astute reader will know straight away that this priest that's in the carriage with Watson is actually Holmes in disguise, which is what it turns out to be. So then they end up in Switzerland. They're up looking at the wonder of the Reichenbach Falls, huge, massive waterfall. And then Watson receives a letter which is brought by a young boy from the hotel where they're staying, and apparently there's an English woman who is close to the end of her life at the hotel, and she needs some medical attention. She won't see any of the local doctors. She insists on seeing an English doctor, and so Watson rushes back to the hotel, leaving Holmes alone. When Watson gets to the hotel, he finds that the letter the young boy had brought him, supposedly from the hotel proprietor, asking Watson to return to the hotel, was actually fake. Watson rushes back to the Reichenbach Falls. He finds just Holmes' staff there, his cane, and there's no sign of Holmes. And then he finds a letter which Holmes has written for him under Sherlock Holmes' cigarette case. And let me read you that letter. So Watson discovers this letter under Holmes's. My dear Watson, I write these few lines through the courtesy of Mr. Moriarty, who awaits my convenience for the final discussion of these questions which lie between us. He has given me a sketch of the methods by which he avoided the English police and kept himself informed of our movements. They certainly confirm the very high opinion which I have formed of his abilities. I am pleased to think that I shall be able to free society from any further effects of his presence, though I fear that it is at a cost which will give pain to my friends, and especially, my dear Watson, to you. And so that's how the story ended. We didn't actually see Holmes go over the falls, but we very much led to believe there that's what happened, because that's what Watson believed happened. And it's almost serendipity, because Doyle didn't intend to bring Holmes back, and it was only the public outcry that forced him to eventually bring him back. But the fact that he left the ending like that, rather than specifically showing us Holmes' death, which allowed Doyle to bring Holmes back in the adventure of the empty house. So then we learn, how did Holmes survive going over the Reichenbach Falls? Well, the fact is he never really went over the Reichenbach Falls, but the final problem is an absolutely fantastic Holmes story. It was when Doyle was asked to list his favourites of his own stories, he placed the final problem at number 4. I don't know if I place it as high as 4 if I rank the Sherlock Holmes stories myself, and perhaps I'll do that one day for fun, because I am quite familiar with the canon. I have read all of the Holmes short stories more than once. I've also read the 4 novels several times. So yeah, perhaps one day I'll do that. But I just wanted to talk a little bit there about the final problem. So if you've enjoyed this video, then please subscribe, give me a big fat juicy thumbs up, and leave a comment down below. So for now, cheers, Solange, Yakida.